On the cold morning of February 14, 1929, while much of America was celebrating love, 7 men stood facing a brick wall inside a Chicago garage, unaware that within moments they would become part of one of the most shocking crimes in American history. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the winter air, and in a matter of seconds, the balance of power in the underworld shifted forever. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was not just another gangland shooting during Prohibition. It was a calculated act of violence that stunned the nation, exposed the ruthless ambition of organized crime, and forced the federal government to confront a growing criminal empire that had long operated in the shadows. To understand how such a brazen execution could occur in broad daylight, it is necessary to step back into the turbulent world of late 1920s Chicago, where illegal alcohol flowed as freely as blood, and rival gangs fought relentlessly for control of a fortune built on defiance of the law. The era of Prohibition, which began in 1920 with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, was intended to curb crime and improve public morality by banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Instead, it created a vast black market that transformed ordinary criminals into wealthy crime bosses. Speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors, hidden distilleries operated around the clock, and trucks loaded with illegal liquor rumbled through city streets under cover of darkness. In this chaotic environment, organized crime syndicates rose to unprecedented power, and Chicago quickly became one of the most dangerous battlegrounds in America. Among the most dominant figures in this violent landscape was Al Capone, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with the Prohibition underworld. Capone, who had taken control of the Chicago outfit after his mentor Johnny Torrio stepped aside, built a sprawling criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars each year through bootlegging, gambling, and other illicit activities. His influence extended into politics and law enforcement, and he cultivated an image that blended charm with intimidation, presenting himself as a businessman even as his organization enforced loyalty through fear. Standing in direct opposition to Capone was George "Bugs" Moran, the leader of Chicago's North Side Gang. Moran controlled key territories that were vital to the distribution of illegal alcohol, and his organization frequently clashed with Capone's South Side operation. The rivalry between these two factions was not merely personal. It was economic, territorial, and deeply rooted in the competition for dominance over the city's lucrative bootlegging routes. Throughout the mid-1920s, a series of violent encounters intensified the feud. Drive-by shootings became common, ambushes were meticulously planned, and retaliatory attacks escalated with each passing month. Both sides sought not only to eliminate rivals, but also to send unmistakable messages of strength. The streets of Chicago bore witness to a steady rise in bloodshed, and ordinary citizens grew increasingly accustomed to headlines detailing gang-related murders. By early 1929, tensions between the two gangs had reached a boiling point. Capone's organization had suffered setbacks in its efforts to dominate the North Side, and Moran remained a persistent obstacle to total control. Eliminating Moran would mean dismantling his network and seizing his territory, a move that could cement Capone's supremacy in the city's underworld. The plan that eventually unfolded on Valentine's Day was rooted in deception and careful preparation. Members of Moran's gang were lured to a garage at 2122 North Clark Street with the promise of a shipment of high-quality, cut-rate whiskey. The offer was designed to appear irresistible, tapping into the constant demand for affordable liquor that fueled the bootlegging economy. As the men gathered inside the garage that morning, they believed they were participating in a routine transaction, unaware that they were stepping into a carefully orchestrated trap. Shortly before 10:30 a.m., a black Cadillac pulled up outside the building. Witnesses later reported seeing men dressed in what appeared to be police uniforms entering the garage. The use of disguises was a chilling stroke of strategy, exploiting the authority associated with law enforcement to disarm suspicion and ensure compliance. The gunmen lined up the victims against the wall, creating the appearance of a standard police raid. Then, in a sudden eruption of violence, the attackers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns and shotguns, unleashing a barrage of bullets that left the 7 men sprawled across the concrete floor. The sheer brutality of the assault was staggering, Dozens of rounds tore through the victims, leaving no doubt that this was an execution intended to eradicate an entire faction in one swift blow. The killers exited the building calmly, with two of them pretending to escort the others out at gunpoint, further reinforcing the illusion of a lawful arrest and minimizing immediate alarm. Ironically, the primary target of the attack, Bugs Moran, was not among the dead. He had been delayed and, upon seeing what he believed to be a police car outside the garage, turned away before entering. His absence ensured that the feud would not end with the massacre, but the loss of his key associates severely weakened his organization. As news of the killing spread, the public reaction was immediate and intense. Newspapers splashed graphic descriptions across their front pages, and photographs of the blood-soaked garage circulated nationwide. The image of bodies lined against a wall became an enduring symbol of the savagery that Prohibition had unleashed. Americans who had previously viewed gang violence as a distant or exaggerated problem were confronted with undeniable evidence of its scale and audacity. Law enforcement officials faced mounting pressure to respond. Although Capone was widely suspected of orchestrating the massacre, proving his direct involvement was another matter. At the time of the killings, he was in Florida, a detail that complicated efforts to tie him legally to the crime. The lack of immediate arrests fueled frustration and highlighted the limitations of local policing in dealing with powerful criminal organizations that operated across state lines and maintained networks of bribery and intimidation. Federal authorities began to recognize that traditional methods were insufficient against syndicates that possessed both wealth and influence. The massacre became a catalyst for a more coordinated and aggressive approach to combating organized crime, setting the stage for future federal intervention. The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked a turning point not only in the gang war between Capone and Moran, but also in the broader national conversation about crime and governance. The spectacle of uniformed gunmen executing 7 men in broad daylight shattered any illusion that the violence of the Prohibition era could be contained or ignored. Public outrage grew louder, and political leaders faced increasing demands to restore order. The event underscored the unintended consequences of Prohibition, revealing how a well-intentioned amendment had inadvertently empowered criminal enterprises to flourish. As Americans grappled with the shock of the massacre, the foundations of organized crime were being reshaped, and the stage was set for a new chapter in the struggle between law enforcement and the underworld. The shockwaves from the massacre did not fade with the winter snow that covered Chicago's streets. Instead, they spread outward, rippling across the nation and forcing Americans to confront a reality they could no longer dismiss as distant criminal chaos. The image of 7 lifeless bodies, arranged against a brick wall, became a symbol of unchecked brutality, and for many citizens, it marked the moment when organized crime ceased to be an underworld curiosity and became a national crisis. Newspapers competed fiercely for details, publishing graphic crime scene photographs and dramatic reconstructions that amplified public horror. The massacre was discussed in homes, workplaces, and government offices, and the question echoed across the country: how had criminal syndicates grown so bold that they could stage a military-style execution in the heart of a major American city? Chicago had long been known for political corruption and gang activity, but the scale and theatrical precision of this attack distinguished it from previous acts of violence. The use of fake police uniforms deeply unsettled the public because it suggested that criminals were willing not only to kill, but also to manipulate symbols of authority. Trust in law enforcement was shaken, and rumors circulated that officers had been bribed or complicit. Although no direct evidence proved official involvement in the massacre itself, the mere possibility reflected the climate of suspicion that surrounded city institutions. Organized crime thrived in environments where officials could be influenced through intimidation or financial incentives, and Chicago's political landscape during Prohibition provided fertile ground for such manipulation. The massacre exposed the consequences of that corruption in a way that no prior incident had. Investigators immediately began piecing together evidence from the crime scene. Ballistics experts examined shell casings and determined that at least 2 Thompson submachine guns had been used in the attack. These weapons, often associated with gangsters and nicknamed Tommy guns, had become icons of Prohibition-era violence. The forensic examination of bullet markings was still a developing science, yet it provided valuable clues. Authorities linked the guns to earlier crimes, suggesting that the massacre was part of a broader pattern of coordinated attacks. Despite these findings, the absence of cooperative witnesses made prosecution difficult. Fear of retaliation kept many silent, and those who might have possessed critical information were often too entangled in criminal networks to come forward. Public pressure intensified as weeks passed without indictments. Suspicion overwhelmingly centered on Al Capone, whose rivalry with Bugs Moran had been well documented. Capone's carefully cultivated public persona began to fracture under scrutiny. He had often portrayed himself as a provider of jobs and services, even claiming to supply a demand that Prohibition had artificially created. Yet the massacre painted a different picture, one of calculated ruthlessness and indifference to human life. Although Capone denied involvement and maintained that he had no knowledge of the attack, his reputation suffered irreparable damage. To many Americans, he embodied the arrogance of organized crime, a symbol of how criminal empires had flourished under the nation's failed experiment with banning alcohol. The federal government, which had previously struggled to assert authority over local crime syndicates, recognized that new strategies were necessary. Prohibition enforcement had been inconsistent and underfunded, allowing bootleggers to operate with relative impunity. The massacre underscored the limitations of relying solely on local police forces that were often outmatched or compromised. In response, federal agencies began coordinating efforts more aggressively. Investigators focused on financial records, tax filings, and interstate activities, areas where federal jurisdiction was clearer. Rather than attempting to prosecute gang leaders solely for violent crimes, authorities sought alternative legal avenues that could yield convictions. This strategic shift would later prove pivotal in dismantling powerful criminal figures. Meanwhile, the North Side gang struggled to recover from the devastating loss of its leadership core. Bugs Moran, who had narrowly avoided death on Valentine's Day, attempted to rebuild his organization. But the massacre had crippled his operational capacity. The elimination of trusted lieutenants disrupted supply chains and weakened alliances. Rival groups sensed vulnerability, and the balance of power in Chicago tilted decisively in favor of Capone's organization. Even so, the massacre did not eliminate violence. Instead, it entrenched the cycle of retaliation and suspicion. Chicago's streets remained tense, and residents lived with the awareness that further bloodshed could erupt at any moment. Nationally, the massacre contributed to a growing re-evaluation of Prohibition itself. Critics argued that the ban on alcohol had inadvertently strengthened criminal enterprises by creating a lucrative black market. The enormous profits from bootlegging funded weapons purchases, bribery, and recruitment, enabling gangs to operate with increasing sophistication. Lawmakers faced mounting pressure to reconsider the effectiveness of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which had implemented it. Although repeal would not occur until 1933, the massacre became one of the most frequently cited examples of Prohibition's unintended consequences. Public opinion gradually shifted as citizens questioned whether the attempt to legislate morality had produced more harm than benefit. Media coverage played a critical role in shaping this shift. Sensational headlines and detailed reporting ensured that the massacre remained in public consciousness long after the initial shock subsided. Journalists analyzed gang rivalries, traced the flow of illegal alcohol, and scrutinized political connections. The narrative of a city held hostage by criminal syndicates resonated nationwide. For many Americans, the massacre symbolized a broader failure of governance and a warning about the dangers of unchecked corruption. It also elevated the concept of organized crime from scattered criminal acts to a structured, hierarchical system requiring coordinated national intervention. As federal authorities intensified investigations, they began targeting Capone through financial scrutiny rather than direct murder charges. Agents meticulously examined discrepancies in his income and expenditures, seeking evidence of tax evasion. This approach reflected a pragmatic recognition that securing convictions for violent crimes was challenging when witnesses feared retaliation and juries could be influenced. Financial crimes, however, left paper trails that were harder to obscure. The massacre indirectly propelled this strategy by highlighting the urgency of holding powerful gang leaders accountable through any available legal means. It demonstrated that allowing such figures to operate unchecked posed a threat not only to rival criminals, but to the rule of law itself. The broader cultural impact of the massacre also influenced public perception of crime and punishment. It intensified debates about federal authority, the balance between state and national enforcement, and the role of investigative journalism. Crime reporting became more detailed and widespread, contributing to a new era of media scrutiny. The public's appetite for understanding the inner workings of criminal syndicates grew, and stories of gangland intrigue captured national attention. At the same time, fear lingered. The brazenness of the massacre suggested that no city was immune to the reach of organized crime, and citizens demanded assurance that similar atrocities would not occur elsewhere. In the months following the massacre, Chicago remained under intense observation. Law enforcement raids increased, and public officials made visible efforts to demonstrate resolve. Although immediate justice for the 7 victims remained elusive, the event had already altered the trajectory of crime enforcement. It exposed weaknesses in existing systems and compelled authorities to adopt more coordinated, intelligence-driven approaches. The massacre did not end organized crime, nor did it instantly dismantle the networks that had flourished during Prohibition, but it marked a decisive moment when complacency gave way to confrontation. As 1929 progressed, the nation found itself at a crossroads. The economic optimism of the Roaring Twenties would soon collapse into the Great Depression, further complicating social and political challenges. Against this backdrop, the memory of the St. Valentine's Day massacre persisted as a stark reminder of how rapidly violence could escalate when law and order faltered. It had transformed a localized gang feud into a symbol of national urgency, forcing leaders and citizens alike to reconsider their approach to crime, governance, and accountability. The massacre's legacy extended beyond the 7 men who lost their lives. It reshaped strategies, altered perceptions, and set in motion a chain of events that would redefine the battle against organized crime in America. The St. Valentine's Day massacre marked a turning point not only in the gang war between Capone and Moran, but also in the broader national conversation about crime and governance. The spectacle of uniformed gunmen executing 7 men in broad daylight shattered any illusion that the violence of the Prohibition era could be contained or ignored. Public outrage grew louder, and political leaders faced increasing demands to restore order. The event underscored the unintended consequences of Prohibition, revealing how a well-intentioned amendment had inadvertently empowered criminal enterprises to flourish. As Americans grappled with the shock of the massacre, the foundations of organized crime were being reshaped, and the stage was set for a new chapter in the struggle between law enforcement and the underworld. As the decade drew to a close, and the memory of the massacre remained etched into the American consciousness, its deeper consequences began to crystallize in ways that extended far beyond a single garage in Chicago. The St. Valentine's Day massacre became more than an episode of gang rivalry. It evolved into a defining case study in how organized crime could exploit economic opportunity, political weakness, and public complacency. The brazenness of the killings forced a reluctant nation to admit that criminal syndicates were not scattered bands of outlaws, but highly structured enterprises capable of strategic planning, disciplined execution, and national reach. The massacre had revealed the frightening efficiency of coordinated violence, and in doing so, it shattered any lingering illusion that Prohibition-era crime was chaotic or amateurish. It was organized, deliberate, and increasingly corporate in structure. Federal authorities, recognizing that piecemeal responses would no longer suffice, began reshaping their approach to law enforcement. The massacre intensified calls for modernization within investigative agencies, particularly at the federal level. Greater emphasis was placed on intelligence gathering, interagency cooperation, and the professionalization of agents. Rather than relying solely on reactive policing, officials sought to build comprehensive cases that targeted the financial infrastructure sustaining criminal empires. The pursuit of tax evasion charges against Al Capone was emblematic of this shift. When Capone was ultimately convicted in 1931, not for murder but for income tax evasion, it underscored a crucial lesson learned in the aftermath of the massacre. Dismantling organized crime required attacking its economic foundation as much as confronting its violence. The public's evolving perception of organized crime played a significant role in shaping policy changes. Before the massacre, many Americans had regarded bootleggers with a degree of ambivalence, even amusement. Speakeasies were fashionable, and illegal liquor was widely consumed across social classes. The violence that accompanied the trade was often dismissed as an unfortunate but distant byproduct. The massacre, however, stripped away romanticized notions of gangster glamour. The stark image of execution-style killings contradicted any narrative that portrayed crime bosses as charming rebels. Instead, they appeared as ruthless executives of violence, willing to eliminate rivals without hesitation. This shift in public sentiment created political momentum for stronger enforcement measures and eventually contributed to the broader debate that led to the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. The repeal of the 18th Amendment fundamentally altered the landscape that had allowed syndicates to flourish so dramatically. By removing the primary source of illegal profit, the government aimed to undercut the economic engine driving gang wars. Yet organized crime did not disappear. It adapted. Syndicates diversified into other illicit ventures, including gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering. The massacre had demonstrated that criminal organizations were resilient and capable of evolving in response to legal changes. As federal agencies refined their strategies, crime networks refined theirs as well, leading to an ongoing cycle of enforcement and adaptation that would characterize much of the 20th century. The cultural legacy of the massacre also endured. It became embedded in American folklore, inspiring books, films, and documentaries that sought to capture the drama and brutality of the event. The narrative of rival gangs, machine guns, and a dramatic ambush captured the imagination of generations. However, beyond its cinematic appeal, the massacre served as a sobering reminder of how quickly lawlessness can escalate when regulatory systems fail to anticipate unintended consequences. The event illustrated that legislation alone cannot eradicate deeply rooted social behaviors, particularly when demand remains strong and enforcement is inconsistent. The lesson was complex and often uncomfortable. Moral objectives, when pursued without comprehensive planning and realistic enforcement capacity, can inadvertently empower those willing to operate outside the law. For Chicago, the massacre marked a painful chapter in its history. The city worked for decades to shed the stigma associated with gangland violence, investing in reforms and institutional improvements. Law enforcement agencies strengthened oversight mechanisms and sought to rebuild public trust. The massacre became a reference point in discussions about police professionalism and accountability. It also reinforced the importance of separating political influence from criminal enterprise, a challenge that many urban centers continued to face throughout the 20th century. The event served as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for institutional reform. In the broader national context, the massacre contributed to the evolution of federal law enforcement into a more centralized and coordinated force. The lessons drawn from the investigation influenced training standards, forensic techniques, and case-building strategies. Ballistics analysis, financial tracking, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation became standard components of major criminal investigations. The massacre's failure to produce immediate murder convictions highlighted gaps in witness protection and evidence collection, prompting reforms aimed at strengthening prosecutorial effectiveness. Over time, these improvements enhanced the government's capacity to confront not only organized crime, but also other forms of complex criminal activity. The psychological impact of the massacre lingered as well. It represented a moment when violence pierced the veneer of prosperity that had defined the Roaring Twenties. In the same year that the stock market would crash and plunge the nation into economic despair, the massacre symbolized a different kind of collapse, the collapse of confidence in the ability of local authorities to contain powerful criminal forces. Together, these events reshaped American society, altering perceptions of security, governance, and institutional reliability. The massacre was not the sole cause of these changes, but it became one of the era's most vivid illustrations of systemic vulnerability. As decades passed, historians continued to analyze the massacre's significance. Some emphasized its role in accelerating federal intervention, while others focused on its symbolic power in shaping public opinion. Regardless of interpretation, consensus emerged on one point. The massacre represented a turning point. It marked the end of an era in which gangland killings could be dismissed as isolated incidents. Instead, it revealed the interconnected nature of organized crime networks and the necessity of comprehensive, coordinated responses. The event's notoriety ensured that it would remain a reference in discussions about criminal justice policy and the balance between civil liberties and enforcement authority. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre ultimately demonstrated that organized crime is not merely a collection of individual acts, but a system sustained by economic opportunity, social demand, and institutional weaknesses. It forced policymakers to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption, enforcement gaps, and unintended legislative consequences. It also illustrated the power of public opinion in driving reform. Without the widespread outrage that followed the killings, federal authorities might have continued to rely on fragmented approaches. Instead, the massacre galvanized momentum for strategic innovation and more assertive action against criminal syndicates. Even today, nearly a century later, the massacre continues to resonate as a reminder of how quickly power struggles can escalate when profit and pride intersect with impunity. It stands as a historical marker in the evolution of American law enforcement, a moment when violence compelled transformation. The 7 men who lost their lives on that February morning became part of a narrative that reshaped national priorities and altered the trajectory of organized crime enforcement. Their deaths exposed vulnerabilities, prompted reforms, and contributed to the dismantling of one of the most notorious criminal empires of the era. The story of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre is not merely about a gang feud. It is about the intersection of law, society, and power. It is about how a single, shocking event can crystallize public awareness and accelerate change. It is about the dangers of allowing criminal enterprises to grow unchecked and the necessity of adapting enforcement strategies to evolving threats. The massacre's legacy endures not because of the number of bullets fired, but because of the profound impact those shots had on the nation's consciousness and its commitment to confronting organized crime with renewed determination. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.